Science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
computing, public health, global
science communication.
Hello everyone, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Today, a consortium to help identify new COVID variants and some fascinating kombucha-related innovation. Both of those are stories in our news section in just a moment. Also, the president or foreign influencers. Where was the disinformation coming from in the most recent US election? And in public health, an unexpected finding.
Being in good health is now a better predictor of future employment opportunities than education. So those who have had low levels of education but are in good health have higher rates of employment than those who have high levels of education and are in poor health.
And we're hearing about a cutting-edge innovation in breast cancer surgery.
The Imperial College Podcast.
All right, then, well, as ever, let's just kick off with a little bit of Imperial College news. And Kate Whiten, let's start with you. And you're going to tell us about this new consortium to look out for threats from new variants of SARS-CoV-2. So tell me a bit more about this.
Exactly. So this is a new consortium headed up by Professor Wendy Barclay from Imperial College. And it's a number of institutions tracking the new variants of COVID-19, keeping an eye on any new variants that do emerge. And as viruses replicate and circulate, they naturally accumulate mutations in their genetic material. This is to be expected. But it's just really important that scientists keep an eye on these variants, track them and find out what they are, because some of them may have an impact on transmissibility, so how easily the virus moves from one person to another, potentially the severity of the disease that it causes, and also something that people are obviously really interested in, which is the effectiveness of vaccines. There's a protein called the spike protein, and this is the protein that the virus uses to enter our cells. But also this protein is really important for the vaccine to recognise the virus. So if there's any changes in this spike protein, then that's something that the researchers want to track and monitor and be aware of at the soonest opportunity.
And a consortium of this kind, including Imperial, it seems to make sense, doesn't it, Kate? Because the UK is well known around the world for having a lot of expertise when it comes to virology and also in sequencing viruses. So that might be a big part of explaining why here and why Imperial.
Absolutely right. So the UK, as you said, does lead in sequencing viruses and particularly, of course, COVID-19. We've got another organisation called the COVID-19 Genomics UK Consortium, which is known as COG UK, who again do fantastic work in sequencing and recognising these new variants as soon as possible. And the UK really is one of the global leaders in this. And as well as Imperial, I should say, there are another 10 research institutions, including King's College London, the University of Glasgow and the Pirbright Institute.
And yes, there's £2.5 million of government funding going into the team as well. All right, lovely. Kate Whiten, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, Caroline Brogan is also here, and we're going to be talking, Caroline, about smart living materials.
So this all came from a drink called kombucha. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Gareth.
A beverage of some sort? My local coffee shop does it. I've seen that.
It's very nice. You should absolutely give it a go.
Okay.
So kombucha, for those who are uninitiated, is a fermented tea drink, which I find rather tasty. It comes in all different flavours. And it's made from a culture of bacteria and yeast known as a SCOBY, or kombucha mother, from which the drink is born. So it means that it has all this bacteria inside the drink, which is supposed to be good for your gut. But scientists at MIT and Imperial studied this culture and realised they could create things other than kombucha from it.
So what kind of things did they end up developing or end up deriving from kombucha?
So they created their own SCOBY, so their own kombucha mother style culture, to develop engineered living materials. These materials are embedded with enzymes that can perform functions like sensing environmental pollutants and purifying water, and cellulose to act as a scaffold for these enzymes. They can even be used in things like packaging. So, for example, they would detect packaging using the enzymes and then respond by fluorescing or glowing to warn consumers of damage.
Well, you've made it sound so simple, Caroline. So is that the whole point then? It's a little bit, could be a bit of DIY smart materials for the rest of us?
Yeah, so you can make kombucha at home in a bucket or your bathtub. And this SCOBY, which they call Sin SCOBY, is no different. So as long as you have some tea, some nutrients and a SCOBY with these materials in them, these enzymes and cellulose that you need, then you can probably make your own sort of living functional materials from this. And it's all inspired by kombucha.
You just have to love kombucha. Thanks very much indeed for that, Caroline. That's Caroline Brogan, and you also heard there from Kate Whiten. Well, now, as Marine One flew Donald Trump out of the White House for the last time a few days ago, the hope is that the era of presidential disinformation has flown away with him. Looking at the last two election campaigns, Imperial researcher Dr Julio Amador Diaz-Lopez says that in 2016, the false information online came from foreign influence campaigns. But the difference in 2020 was that the disinformation came from the president himself. That insight from Julio, a research fellow at the Imperial College Business School, comes in a recent blog post for The Forum, Imperial's Science and Policy Engagement programme. Kieran Brophy has been speaking to Julio and hearing what other features have been at play on the internet during these final months of the Trump presidency. Oh, and apologies for the occasional bit of background sound, but hey, we're all working from home, aren't we?
There were a couple of Facebook groups that were cancelled because they were trying to push people, on the one hand, on the Black Lives Matter camp to incite violence using these groups. And on the other hand, like the Trump supporters, they were trying to push forward this narrative of, between quotations, fraud, because there is no fraud. And those sort of misinformation and those sort of groups were actually caught very quickly by social media companies. So what was surprising was the way in which the media caught up to the game, and they changed completely the way in which they were handling. So I've been trying to think about what are these differences between 2016 and 2020. And probably the main difference in 2016 is that all the traditional media was facing strong competition from the online media outlets. So traditional media was willing to push forward whichever piece of information that they thought that might actually buy them some influence. Now, fast forward to 2020, and what we see is that traditional media has already learned how to cope with the online world. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, they all have now very well-established business models. They know how to act. They actually made editorial decisions about what should go out and what should stay.
I see recently that the fact that Fox News cut away from Donald Trump speaking, or at least one of Donald Trump's aides speaking live on TV, I think that was interesting in itself. And the fact that you mentioned social media flagging posts that mightn't be true, and that's certainly true for Twitter, might not be so true for Facebook. What impact do you think this is actually having on the people reading these posts or not reading these posts?
So what has been the consensus so far is that traditional media, and now in a growing way online social media, are useful in organizing information, and they are actually useful in setting a narrative. And this was the precise aspect of, for instance, Fox News. If Fox News hadn't announced that Biden won Arizona, if Fox News hadn't announced that Biden now won Pennsylvania or Georgia, I really do not want to imagine what would be the picture of the United States right now,
And so, Julio, you've written a blog on misinformation that you can see on the Forum's website. And in the blog, you pose the question, do we really want Facebook or Twitter to be the gatekeepers of information? And I'm going to ask you your own question to yourself. Do you have an answer to that?
The traditional news media have been actually quite good gatekeepers. And now the people of online social media companies are adopting these editorial powers, let's call them. These are smart folks without any doubt. But the problem is that they usually do not have the training that these people at editorial boards in traditional media have. I wouldn't trust social media. I wouldn't trust Mark Zuckerberg. He has been called to act upon a lot of time. And there are very good reasons why there are regulators operating. I think that they should act on that.
Dr. Julio Amador Diaz-Lopez speaking there to Kieran Brophy. And you can hear the full version of that interview on Kieran's excellent Never Lick the Spoon podcast. Check it out. Kieran has also done some excellent reporting on the COVID-19 research going on here at Imperial. And with a name like Never Lick the Spoon, it's nice and easy to find in your favourite podcatcher. Well, here's a message to employers up and down the land. You have a duty to safeguard and promote the health of your employees. And if you fail to achieve that, you must pay a levy towards improving wider public health. That's just one solution that Dr Jonathan Pearson-Stuttard proposes to improve the health of us all. Not only should employers take more responsibility, we all should. Your good health benefits me, and vice versa. So argues Jonathan of Imperial School of Public Health in his new book, Whose Health Is It Anyway? And soon after the book came out last month, Ryan O'Hare caught up with Dr Pearson-Stuttard.
What we look at in the book is that we think the NHS really was set up in many ways as an illness service, because when it was set up, we got acute illnesses, you were treated and hopefully you recovered and you were back in the community. But if you look at what dominates our sort of ill health profiles now, of course we do have acute illness. COVID-19 illness is a good example, but we have heart attacks and so forth. But so much of this actually, our health burden to individuals and populations and the nation, are living with long-term chronic conditions that most of the time we're just living a little bit less in good health than we'd like. So we pick up on that and say, whilst the illness service does a great job and actually should probably be expanded on its funding and so forth, that we do need a sort of true health service, which is based out in the community, keeping people with chronic conditions living well for longer, so that actually their illness isn't interfering with their day-to-day life and enjoyment and so forth.
But being slightly selfish, going wider than that, why should I care about your health? Why should you care about my health? Why is good health important for us as a nation and economy?
Well, it's really interesting. So on the flip side, we look at illness, and the COVID pandemic clearly has identified how vulnerable we all are collectively to our ill health. But it's also shown that even though collectively we're all vulnerable, that it's far from equal. Those in the most deprived communities consistently have been more adversely affected during that. But then when we look at the reverse, as we're living longer, actually the gap in healthy life expectancy is getting more and more too. So we're living longer, but longer of our life is lived in poor health. And that's where it starts to impact our economic productivity. And so actually a healthier population, both working age but also retirement age, would lead to a healthy economy because of increased productivity, but also reduction in health-related benefits. And then when we looked further at that, we found what's really interesting is we all know that education is extremely important for social mobility, for opportunity. We actually looked at the data and found that being in good health is now a better predictor of future employment opportunities than education. So those who have had low levels of education but are in good health have higher rates of employment than those who have high levels of education and are in poor health. And so investing in health could both help clearly on the educational aspects but also on employment opportunities too.
We're extremely lucky in the four nations of the UK to have the NHS, the National Health Service, and it's a fantastic leveller. But why then are we still seeing such massive inequalities in things, as you said, like life expectancy from region to region then? Why are we seeing this if we have a national health service? Well,
it's really interesting. And if you start at mortality and then work backwards, universal access clearly does reduce inequalities, that the NHS still has a large role to play too. But if you look at life expectancy, the gap between the most affluent 10% and the most deprived 10%, for example, in women, is about 8 years. And that's increased from 6 years in 2000 to 8 years a couple of years ago. Then if you look at healthy life expectancy, it's double that at 18.9 years. And so the further you get from actually mortality into are you living with chronic diseases for longer, the wider the gap gets between the rich and the poor. That really sort of embeds and exacerbates the inequalities right through society.
And can you put it in sort of very basic terms for us? What are the sort of key factors here that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we look in the book, look at the drivers of health. So for example, often the most affordable, most accessible food is the most unhealthy food. It's difficult if you're in a low income family to eat healthily, especially if you're time poor. But similarly then, if you look at smoking, we all know that smoking rates have declined massively over the last few decades. But whilst the average rate's declined around 15% now, the gap between the richest and the poorest has got bigger than ever. And smoking in pregnancy is such a stark example of that. So in some of the richest areas, like Wokingham, smoking in pregnancy is down around 1% or even lower. In Blackpool, it's 28%. And so you think of how big that gap is in smoking in pregnancy, and that is playing through to life chances even before children are born, and that really embeds these inequalities in there. And then we move on to the social drivers aspect, so whether it's the housing environments you've got, the access to green space, and at every level really, this gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger between the environment you're born into and whether it's a health promoting or health harming environment.
So that's a fantastic overview of the problems. We know the problems, as you said, they're quite stark. What are some of the solutions? And is there one aspect or element that will have more impact than others?
Well, there's an underlying sort of crux of this, which is that we talked about the healthy choice becoming the easy choice. And so in that, we talked about a play or pay concept. If you're a company, if you're a local public sector employer, you should either play your part to improve the health of your workforce or local community. And if you don't play your part, you should pay. And it's a levy that goes into a public health investment fund. That fund is then invested, targeting the areas which have the most need to level up as quickly as possible. On the healthcare side, we said that we know we've got a great illness service, and that should be extended much further, though. One, to this health service that sort of exports health into communities, but also into dignity of old age as well. So a national care service built on the same founding principles of the NHS back in 1948.
What do you want people to take away from the book and take away from the work?
The idea of the book was to reframe how we look at health. This isn't going to happen overnight, and this is something that will take a very long time and lots of thought because it's a really complex issue. No one's done it really before. No one's transitioned from illness through to health and framing health as an asset to the economy. So we're keen for people to read, to enjoy, and to start that debate about what health means to each of us and how we prioritise it as a nation going forward.
That's Dr Pearson-Stuttard speaking there to Ryan O'Hare. Well, finally, and staying on matters health-related, welcome to the cutting edge in the operating theatre, fluorescence-guided surgery. Researchers at the Institute of Global Health Innovation are developing technology to improve breast-conserving surgery, and it consists of a camera device using a fluorescence imaging system to illuminate the cancerous tumour during surgery. The idea is to prevent people with breast cancer from having to endure another round of surgery. Hayley Dunning has been finding out more from Martha Kedrisky, a clinical research fellow based at the Hamlin Centre, and also PhD student Maria Leiloglu.
At the moment, surgeons are quite limited in what they can see and feel during the operation. And there's certain techniques that can help you find the heart of the tumour, like wires or seeds, but they don't give you a full scope of how big is the tumour, how invasive is the tumour. And so they just give you a rough idea of where the heart of the tumour is. And so that leads to someone, about 20%, having to have another surgery because we've left some of the tumour behind.
So how are you trying to improve these surgeries and reduce the likelihood of needing a second surgery?
What is needed is a tool to help the surgeons to resect the tumour. We propose for this fluorescence imaging to help the surgeon to clearly see where the tumour is during the surgery. And essentially, we use a patient-safe contrast agent, which we inject intravenously. It is accumulated in the tumour, and then when we use light, we make it fluoresce, that is, we make it to emit light, and we capture this with our cameras and indicate the location in the surgeon in real time.
It's interesting. So what are the advantages of this approach over current techniques?
This approach is real-time, and the equipment is very straightforward to use, in contrast with MRI or CT scanners. It blends seamlessly with the operational workflow because the equipment is ergonomic and can be easily used by the surgeons. And the equipment is non-expensive, in contrast again with MRI or CT. The resolution is very good, as we are talking optics here, as opposed to, for example, ultrasound imaging or radio tracers. And it's also a very flexible approach because you can use many different contrast agents in order to target different tumors, and also you image those agents simultaneously with the camera.
So if I can just add to that, it really easily fits into the clinical workflow just because surgeons, at least when they're operating, we're quite used to sometimes having a monitor displaying things like when we do laparoscopic surgery. So it fits in quite seamlessly into our workflow. In addition to that, you have the scope of not only identifying where the heart of the tumor is, but through the visual feedback, the surgeon can see where the tumor is even before they start cutting, how big it is, how invasive it is. So you can actually not only localize, but identify the tumor. And so that's quite useful, and it gives us more feedback than the other techniques that we have available at the moment.
It sounds like a very promising technique. So what progress have you made in testing it? Have you trialled it? It sounds like you have been using it in surgery.
As part of Maria's PhD, we actually did a feasibility trial using the Fluorescence camera that she and Prof. Elson have developed. So we checked in 10 patients the fluorophore indocyanin green, which is a passive fluorophore and leaks into tumors. And so we gave it to patients during their surgery, and then we took pictures. And now we are doing part 2 of the clinical trial. So that is in 40 patients. We are giving indocyanin green, and in the next 40, we will give a different fluorophore called aminolevulinic acid. And that one accumulates in tumors with essentially deranged enzymes causing it to build up, and then it should give us a larger signal in tumor than normal tissue.
It's very important to state in here that the results of the first clinical trial were very promising because, first of all, we proved the feasibility of the method. We managed to see the fluorescence signal in vivo, which was a very positive result and what made us pursue it further and start with the second clinical trial. And also the second is that we used texture metrics in the fluorescence image to try to identify tumor, and this method gave us a very good accuracy in identifying tumor, reaching up to 90%, which is also very good, and a second reason of why we wanted to pursue it further with a second clinical trial.
How have you found the participants, and how willing have they been to help you?
So I've been really surprised by how willing most women are to participate in this kind of research and to push things forward. They've been so wonderful and brave in the context of a scary diagnosis, and the amount of people that are willing to try and help change the world has really impressed me. Maybe like 10-15% don't want to know what the results are just because as far as they're concerned they did their bit to help, but at the end of the day I'm so grateful for their help because without them we wouldn't have been able to achieve anything.
That's making good progress, and if it does get all the way to being used in clinical practice, what will improving these surgeries mean for patients and indeed the NHS?
That 20% of women that have a bit of tumour behind end up needing a second surgery. So these poor women who are already scared out of their minds and having to do it once have to do it a second time. And not only is that an anesthetic risk and a surgical risk, but cosmetically, your breast will not look as nice if I'm taking out just the lump and then having to do it again. I leave less behind. In addition to that, all of their extra treatment gets pushed back. So if they need chemotherapy or radiotherapy, well, they can't get that until all the scar has healed. And so if we can try and address that, it's better for the NHS, it's better for patients.
Martha Kidrisky and Maria Leiloglu, and they were both speaking to Hayley Dunning. And that brings this edition to an end. Don't forget that you can find us on all your favourite pod platforms, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud. I probably missed a few out there. And also Entail, mustn't forget that one. Visual podcasting on Entail, give that a try. So we'll have more for you next time, but for now, from me, Gareth Mitchell, thanks very much for listening, and goodbye.